Welcome to Echoes of History, a Ubisoft podcast brought to you by History Hit. This is the place to explore the rich stories from the past that bring the world of Assassin's Creed to life. I'm Matt Lewis. The next 7 episodes continue our exciting adventure into the heart of an era that has shaped legends. In case you hadn't seen it, the world premiere trailer for Assassin's Creed Shadows was released recently, and we can see that it takes place in feudal Japan, a time renowned for its samurai and ninjas, a time rich in history, culture, and stories. Over the next few weeks, we'll navigate the intricate landscape of power and ambition, which you'll be able to explore in Shadows, and introduce you to the figures who dominated and dared to defy. In our last episode, we delved into the chaos and upheaval of the Sengoku period as we began our journey exploring the fascinating period in history in which Shadows is set. Today, we pick up where we left off, delving deeper into the final years of the Sengoku period to explore how the actions of a few pivotal daimyo led to the unification of Japan. I'm joined again by Dr. Chris Harding from the University of Edinburgh to discover how these ambitious warlords, some of whom you can meet in Shadows, ruthlessly subjugated their rivals and brought about the unification of a region that had been riven by civil war and social upheaval for over a century. Well, Chris, it's great to have you back to talk about the conclusion, I guess, of what we talked about before and cover the unification of Japan. So just in terms of where we're coming at this from, we've gone through this Sengoku period, the Warring States period. What, I guess, are the main characteristics of that period, and how did it lay the groundwork for the eventual unification of Japan?
I think the background for the Sengoku period was the disintegration, basically, of any central authority in Japan. There had been a shogunate functioning based in a particular neighborhood of Kyoto, and really from the 1460s onwards, for at least a century, the writ of that shogunate no longer ran across the rest of Japan. And so you have a kind of all against all of these more or less independent fiefdoms. That's really what makes up the Sengoku period.
So it's really an effort to get back to where it started almost. But the question is, who's going to be on top?
Yes, I think that's right. So there's always the thought amongst certainly some of the higher ranking of these warlords that the aim is to gather together a coalition of people, conquer enough territory so that you can have control of Kyoto, where the shogun still rather feebly sits, where the emperor is still based, who attracts, of course, an enormous amount of respect amongst people, divinely descended also with a centuries-old history. So that Kyoto really does need to be the center of this unification project, but with perhaps new people de facto in charge.
And who were some of the main players in the process of the unification? We've talked a bit about Oda Nobunaga. Is he the first significant figure that we should think about? And what do we know about his background and how he becomes a central figure in the story?
So I think he is certainly the first significant figure here. People in Japan, school children actually, when they're learning about history, they'll learn about 3 great unifiers who sort of came along one after the other. So you've got Oda Nobunaga first, you've got Hideyoshi Toyotomi afterwards, and then finally you've got Tokugawa Ieyasu. There's a lovely little rhyme that some people learn, which goes something like this: Nobunaga pounded the rice, Hideyoshi baked the cake, and Ieyasu ate it. So there's a sense that each person builds on the other, and the final rewards, as we'll see, go to Tokugawa Ieyasu. Each man with a slightly different character, which we'll probably get at along the way. So in terms of Oda Nobunaga, not an especially promising background, I think. If you think about the era into which he's born, there are roughly 120 of these states, some of them at war with others, some of them in alliance, etc. But his state or province, Owari, is just one of those, and quite a small one at that. Plus, I think it's 1551, his father dies when Oda Nobunaga is still quite young, still a teenager, and he inherits control of this state, and the people around him don't see him as an especially serious figure, an especially compromising figure. You can imagine some of the senior vassals, a little bit older than him, thinking, goodness me, I don't know what's going to happen to our little province with this person in charge. He was, I think, just seen as being slightly mad, a bit of an idiot, not really able to take life terribly seriously. And yet, within a few short years, he proves himself to be this master strategist who becomes, by the mid-1560s, really the main player in Japan out of all these warlords. So an unexpected and very rapid rise for this man.
Was there anything in particular about the territory where he's based that makes that rise easier or perhaps more likely? I'm wondering if having a small province sounds like a disadvantage, but I guess to some extent you have less to worry about spreading your control over than in a big territory. Does he have a really firm grip on his own lands that allows him to look outwards quicker than some other people can?
That might well be the case. Yeah, he doesn't seem to have a great deal of trouble within his province, and he's able to look out from it elsewhere, I think, quite quickly. What he succeeds in doing is very early on gaining control of a neighboring province, and then he makes a very fortuitous alliance with the man who becomes Tokugawa Ieyasu. He doesn't yet have that name at this point in the 1550s, but that's a great alliance. It allows Oda Nobunaga not to have to worry too much about the territory to one side of his own province, and so he can look elsewhere for his focus. But I think other things that seem to go in his favor include a real talent for strategy, choosing the right moment to attack. I think an extraordinary ruthlessness to him as well, a certain amount of luck. One of his arch enemies, Takeda is his family name, is taken ill and dies just on the verge of attacking Oda Nobunaga. So there is an element of luck involved here. I think a lot of his enemies would probably say also of him that there is a willingness to be extraordinarily brutal in going about his aim. So he has this motto, Tenka Fubu, which means something like rule the realm by force, given to him by a Zen Buddhist priest. And he really seems to completely take that to heart. That's entirely how he behaves. There's actually quite a nice, almost a kind of phrase or proverb, perhaps, that gives people a sense of the character of these three different people, these three different unifiers that I was talking about early on. And it goes something like this. It says, what to do with a cuckoo that refuses to sing. So Hideyoshi, who's thought about as being clever and charismatic, you will encounter him later on, would find some way to persuade it to sing. Tokugawa Ieyasu, famously patient and canny and wise, would watch and wait while he worked out what this bird was all about and when it might find its voice. What would Nobunaga do? The bird would have to die. So those are the three different approaches amongst these men. And Nobunaga certainly has, I think, the bloodiest reputation of all three.
It's amazing how many people in history that we still consider to be great men are influenced both by luck, but are also just incredibly brutal and cruel figures that we probably wouldn't like to see in the world today.
I think that's right. It's odd when I come across Japanese reflections on Oda Nobunaga. I think people are aware of the brutality, but I think there's a sense of someone who can, almost by sheer force of will, accomplish all that he did. I think in any era when you're worried about your own country disintegrating or going backwards, looking back in time to a figure who seemed to be able to put the pieces together however they went about it, I think is still something that people are very tempted to do, and perhaps even say that in an era like that, a shrinking violet wouldn't have got very much done. It takes someone of the character of Oda Nobunaga to make anything happen.
And so when does Nobunaga die, and how close to unifying Japan is he by the time he dies?
So I think by the time he dies in 1582, he has control of large parts of Japan's main island, the long, thin island of Honshu. Contains places like Tokyo, as it's now called, Kyoto, of course, Osaka. For centuries, really, the central part of that central island, really across from Osaka and Kyoto up to what we now call Tokyo, has been considered, as it were, the business end of Japan. That's where a lot of the power plays go on, the culture is developed, the economy is at its strongest. And Oda Nobunaga has control of most of that, certainly between himself and his allies in any case. And he's thinking about moving moving into two other of Japan's main islands, Kyushu, which is towards the southwest, and also the smaller island of Shikoku. So he's got lots of plans. He's still a relatively young man. He's in an extraordinarily powerful position, and he's just setting out in early part of 1582 for the next part of that campaign, staying at a temple called Honnoji in Kyoto, when he's attacked actually not by his enemies, but by someone who is supposed to be on his side, one of the famous treacherous figures, I suppose, in Japanese history, a man by the name of Akechi Mitsuhide, who persuades his men to turn their guns on Oda Nobunaga and his own men. And so you have these stories of Oda Nobunaga shouting out treachery or traitors or something like that, trying to fight them off himself. The temple ends up in flames, and Oda Nobunaga retreats further into the temple and dies by his own hand. So pretty much an unexpected turn of events, given the 20 years or so, almost 30 years actually, of extraordinary success that he's been enjoying up until that point. Even just the year before, actually, in 1581, he was doing so well that he managed to stage this enormous military parade involving loads and loads of his troops just near the imperial palace in Kyoto, with the emperor looking on. I think something like 130,000 men, an extraordinary display of power under the gaze of the emperor. The imperial family really having not much choice but cozy up to Oda Nobunaga, who's clearly the person in the ascendant in Japan. But then, yeah, a year later, there he is dying by his own hand, and the next unifier comes along, I suppose.
Yeah, it sounds a little bit like, I mean, I know he dies by his own hand, but it sounds almost like the Julius Caesar story, doesn't it? It's not his enemies who manage to defeat him on a battlefield. It's actually his allies who betray him.
Yes, absolutely. And perhaps it counts against Oda Nobunaga slightly. You know, this is someone who's often revered for his strategic nous and his abilities on the battlefield, that perhaps when it came to his own personal security, he wasn't as tight as he might have been. He always had his own horse guards around him. He had a group of extraordinarily loyal figures who would always be around him. But perhaps having enough intelligence on potential rivals within your own ranks, that's somewhere where he may have fallen short there towards the end. A result of overconfidence? I'm not really sure, but perhaps.
Yeah. So what comes next? What follows Nobunaga's death?
Another kind of rags to riches type figure, actually, although even more rags than in Oda Nobunaga's case, a man called Hideyoshi Toyotomi is the name that he eventually uses. In any case, very lowly foot soldier. We were talking in our previous episode about the importance of these foot soldiers, or ashigaru, to battles in this period. So Hideyoshi Toyotomi was one of those. Now and again, he carried the sandals of Oda Nobunaga. Oda Nobunaga used to refer to him affectionately as that bald rat. Hideyoshi's famously sort of short on a bit of hair, but nevertheless, he rises through the ranks to be a senior and trusted man under Oda Nobunaga. So immediately he rushes from where he's been fighting over to take care of the traitors, and he brings the traitors' head back to Kyoto to effectively lay at the feet of Oda Nobunaga's body to say, here we are, you know, I've taken care of this for you. And Hideyoshi really then becomes the inheritor, I think, of this project to try to unify Japan. And his major next step, one of the steps that Oda Nobunaga would have taken had he lived, was to attack Kyushu. So if people think about the map of Japan at the top, we've got what we now call Hokkaido, not of great strategic interest in this period. Then you've got the long arcing island of Honshu, which is where most of the action's been taking place. And if you carry on with that arc, you've got this quite substantially sized island of Kyushu, which is home to Nagasaki. And here, the provinces in this part of Japan, and again, this links back to something we said in a previous episode, have been under the control in large part of the families, the descendants of the people who were originally sent there under the Kamakura shogunate back in the 12th and 13th centuries to oversee that part of Japan. So they're incredibly embedded in Kyushu, a real sense of their right to control that place. And yet for Hideyoshi, Kyushu is a part of Japan that he simply must have. So he sends around 250,000 men over to Kyushu to take it for himself, which he manages to do in fairly short order in 1586 and 7.
Does Hideyoshi then model himself on Nobunaga to any extent, given that he was previously his master and how successful Nobunaga had been? Does he kind of try to pick it up, or do we see differences in their approach?
I think they're different characters, certainly. Hideyoshi, as that phrase I offered earlier on, the saying, suggests, quite a canny operator and someone who I think faced challenges of his own, actually, in this period. We mentioned in a previous episode that Oda Nobunaga had this powerful hatred for these Buddhist sects who were wealthy enough. Some of them had their own warrior monks at their command as well. Others, we mentioned one sect, Jodo Shinshu, who could effectively get peasants and merchants to rise up as a pop-up army and fight for them. Oda Nobunaga had a really powerful hatred and fear of these powerful Buddhist sects in Japan. Hideyoshi, for his part, had a powerful dislike of Christians. So the island of Kyushu in this period was probably the part of Japan where Christian missionaries, Portuguese and Spanish, mainly the Jesuits, but also others as well, had since the 1550s been making quite a large number of converts. So some of the warlords, the daimyo in Kyushu, were actually Christians who had a mixture of Portuguese and Spanish and Japanese names. And Hideyoshi was astounded to find when he got to Kyushu that he found some Christian missionaries offering him to kind of broker deals with warlords, help him take over the island. These people, as far as Hideyoshi were concerned, were foreigners preaching a foreign faith. He discovered that Nagasaki had been raised up into this great port city by the Jesuits, who had effectively been given Nagasaki by a local warlord. So the extraordinary influence that a foreign power preaching a foreign religion had in Kyushu, I think, upset Hideyoshi very much. He liked Portuguese fashion. He now and again wore the kind of baggy trousers the Portuguese might wear, the reliquaries hanging around them, the daggers hanging off them, the Portuguese fashion of the time. He loved all that, but he had a very powerful dislike of, I think, foreigners generally, Christians in particular, something I think distinguishes him from Oda Nobunaga. I think one other thing that distinguishes Hideyoshi probably is the sheer scope of his ambition. So for Oda Nobunaga, what he wanted to do was to try and maintain power in the central part of Japan on Honshu, Kyoto at the center, as we've said. Hideyoshi, once he's taken Kyushu, just a few years later, launches invasions of Korea. So he sends troops across, including some of Christian warlords commanding them, across to Korea, wanting to use it almost as China's driveway, if you think about the geography of it. Send these troops up through Korea, take over the peninsula, eventually invade and take over China. And after that, he also wanted to take over India as well. So he saw himself as this ruler across a large, what we would think of being a large swathe of the eastern part of the world. So in many ways, an even more ambitious character than Oda Nobunaga.
I was going to say, he does seem to have that genuine ambition beyond the unification of Japan. You know, he's thinking, okay, once that's done, here's all the other places I'm going to go to next. So there is no sense that the job is unification of Japan. That's almost like a stepping stone to all of the other things he wants to do.
Absolutely. And he writes these threatening letters to the rulers of Korea, the Philippines, of course, under Spanish control at this point, and China. The one use I think he does have for Christian missionaries is as a source of intelligence on these other parts of the world. I suppose the Jesuits in particular have quite a big presence in places like India, also in China, so they can be quizzed to find out what makes these places tick and how they might be dealt with. It's almost as though for Hideyoshi, you know, the establishment of his power in Japan has pretty much been achieved. Once you've got Honshu, you've got Kyushu, this northern island, what we now call Hokkaido, isn't of terribly much interest. It's pretty much job done, I think, by 1590, which is when his final major opponent in eastern Japan is overcome. So perhaps it's natural that he would start to look outwards and think, where next?
So is Hideyoshi the individual that we should think about as the final unifier of Japan, the man who successfully achieves what's taken more than 100 years to get to?
I think some people would probably see him as that major figure because he manages to fight what seem to be those last battles. But I suppose There is one final figure who most of us would consider to be the man who really establishes things, because although Hideyoshi has done very well by 1590, as I say, he pretty much has most parts of Japan wrapped up under his control, and he's starting to think about internal administration. He introduces measures, for example, to disarm the peasantry. So if you want to end this period of all against all warfare, he wants to return to a position where most people cannot bear arms, and it's very clear who can and who can't, and where you sit in these various samurai hierarchies. So he does all these bits of internal administration too. I suppose another thing he starts to do is to launch these surveys of the land, something that Oda Nobunaga had started to an extent, but Hideyoshi really goes for it to get a sense of who going forward owns what in Japan, what kind of tax you ought to pay. So the things that, maybe strike some fans of history as a bit dull, but nevertheless are a sign, I think, of a new order starting to entrench itself. So he does all that, but his Korean campaign goes badly wrong in the 1590s. The Chinese finally put some men in the field and they push the Japanese troops all the way back down the Korean peninsula. So it doesn't go anywhere except for poisoning relations with Korea for a very long time to come. And then in 1598, Hideyoshi dies. And the one thing he doesn't manage to do, and I suppose fans of history from Europe and elsewhere, there's similar things happen here. One thing you want to do if you're a newly established ruler is make sure that the succession is in place, that when you're gone, your family will continue your work after you. Unfortunately, he dies when his son Hideyori is still too young to assume power. And so you have this council of elders who are controlling things until Hideyori is old enough to rule by himself. But unfortunately, on that council of elders is one Tokugawa Ieyasu, who, while professing a certain amount of loyalty to Hideyori, is plotting and scheming instead to take it all for himself. And so he becomes our third major figure.
The man who you mentioned before gets to eat the cake.
Exactly, yeah. So I think the beginning of that eating of the cake is probably with one of these great battles in Japanese history, the Battle of Sekigahara, which happens in 1600. So you've got a couple of nervous years, or a bit less than that, after the death of Hideyoshi. This council in place, but people are wondering really whether it will stick. And what happens instead, I think, is you get the build-up of two sides that take the form in the end of an Eastern and a Western army. And Tokugawa Ieyasu is at the head of the Eastern army. And in the autumn of Sekigahara, he wins out. And really everything goes to him, and shortly afterwards he has himself appointed shogun. So you have the return of that title that's been so powerful centuries before in Japan. And again, that sort of looks like he's wrapped things up. We're thinking about around the period of 1603 or so by this point. And one thing he does manage to do, I think quite successfully, is he stations some troops in Kyoto to keep the emperor under a watchful eye, not necessarily because of what the emperor might do, but what people might use the emperor for. Some of his Western enemies, as in the western part of Japan, might potentially take the emperor as a figurehead and launch a further action against him. It's not as though after a great battle like that, everyone on the losing side thinks, fair enough, you've got me, I'll walk away and agree to this. So he has that power established in Kyoto. His own power base is Edo, this castle town that is now the great city of Tokyo. So his shogunate is really run out of Edo. That's where his advisors are, his castle is, his strong economy is, and he manages to really build up Edo, I think, in short order. The other thing he does, which is really establishing this process of unification, really establishing the new Japan, is he does this enormous reshuffling of territory in Japan. I think it's the biggest reshuffling of territory in terms of who controls what in Japan's history. So lots of the people who are on the losing side at the Battle of Sekigahara either lose everything, or their territory is drastically cut down, or they're shipped off to another part of the country entirely. Perhaps all these things that are designed to damage their power. He also, as part of that reshuffle, takes over a system that Hideyoshi used to use called Sankin Kwotai. Basically, it's an alternate attendance system is what it means. In fact, it's a hostage system. And under that system, the daimyo has to be in Edo each alternate year. And when the daimyo isn't there, when he's back in his own domain, key members of his family have to be in Edo instead. So that if he does anything back at home, he launches some kind of attack on Tokugawa Ieyasu, then his family will all be slaughtered. So all these different moves that he starts to make, I think in those early years after Sekigahara, really give you the impression anyway of someone who's starting to entrench their power and launch Japan on this brand new path.
This is After Dark, Myths, Misdeeds and the Paranormal.
The podcast that takes you to the shadiest corners of the past, unpicking history's spookiest, strangest and most sinister stories. I'm Maddie Pelling.
And I'm Anthony Delaney. Join us every Monday and Thursday and we'll take a look at the darker side of history, from haunted pubs to Houdini to witch trials and arsenic-laced breakfasts.
Follow After Dark, Myths, Misdeeds and the Paranormal wherever you get your podcasts. Brought to you by History Hit.
What do you think motivated particularly these three men, I guess, but also their enemies? Is there anything beyond the simple desire for power and to be back in that position of shogun, to be the one man who's on top? Is there any real broader motivation than that?
I think some of the daimyo would have said that their primary objective was to defend what was theirs. So ensure that the territory they controlled was peaceful, was profitable, wasn't in danger of being impinged upon by anybody else. I think certainly the more modest daimyo, he fancied a quiet life, would have said that. I think others would have said that there is something disordered about a country where the central authority in Kyoto no longer really works. And so for some of them, there is that sense of mission to try to restore that. But of course, also then with people like Oda Nobunaga and Hideyoshi Toyotomi, it's power, isn't it? It's that prospect of being at the top of a brand new hierarchy in Japan, albeit one that still operates more or less according to the old rules. You still need to have the blessing of the emperor. And for Tokugawa Ieyasu, it's still important to take the title, I think, of shogun. But nevertheless, that yearning for power and the sense that in the past, Japan had been unified and that that's a natural state for it to return to.
I'm conscious that we've talked about a lot of men. Are there any significant women that play a role in the unification of Japan?
Some of the significant women in Japanese history tend to come mainly in earlier eras, to be honest. That said, I suppose for the role of elite women, at least in this period, you often see in Japanese dramas, for example, they're there as wise counsel for the men, especially mothers of younger leaders giving advice in private. They're quite good at pulling the strings of various men. I think they're very good in negotiations, trying to sort of grease the wheels of some of these alliances that are important to this period. You don't see as many women on the battlefield, I think, in this era. In previous eras of Japanese history, you found women who are serving as empress. You found women who are effectively controlling the shoguns as though they're naughty little boys. And you found women who will be out there on the battlefield fighting alongside the men and claiming their rewards. But I think for this period, there aren't too many standout women, but I think there's a lot going on behind the scenes.
I'm struggling not to imagine a Japanese version of he's not the Messiah, he's a very naughty boy.
I think it kind of worked that way. It's always the peril, isn't it? When you've got a system that relies on succession, that if you don't have promising figures, someone like a mother has to sort of take them in hand and provide the wise leadership, or it can all go wrong. I think even with various shoguns in the new shogunate, the Tokugawa shogunate, certainly when that shogunate starts to fall apart later on, you do find people saying it's a kind of inbreeding, or these shoguns are brought up in such luxury that they don't really have any kind of hard-won wisdom at all. So I think it is very much that. And when men are failing, it's often women who sort of step in and prop them up, isn't it?
We've talked about the preference, it seems like, in Japan for it to be a unified country again, that was the end goal of a process of sort of 100 years of war. Given that seems to be what most people wanted, were there any real obstacles along the way? Were there those who would have preferred things to stay fractured? Were there those fighting against the unification of Japan?
I think there were those certainly after 1600 who resisted the idea of the Tokugawa dynasty establishing itself and taking over Sekigahara in 1600. You've got a lot of these Western daimyo who are, to put it colloquially, I suppose, seriously cheesed off about what has happened. And very importantly, I talked about the emperor being possibly one potential figurehead if they were going to launch an attack on the Tokugawa and their allies. Because, of course, seen from our point of view, the Tokugawa dynasty lasts for 250 years. But in 1600, in 1601, in 1602, this is a blip. This isn't necessarily something which is going to last any time at all. So whether you might gather around the emperor or whether you might gather around the still surviving son of Hideyoshi, this young boy Hideyori, who is holed up in Osaka Castle, there is still that sense of a prospect for having another Sekigahara, having another go at that conflict, and if possible, getting a second outcome. So I think probably this is why some historians don't think about 1600 as being the end of the Sengoku period. They would probably go on another 30 or 35 years. And I think that's for a couple of reasons. One is that Hideyori is still around. And that really isn't taken care of until a very famous incident, 1614 to 15, which is the siege of Osaka. It's one of these events in Japanese history which is told and retold on the stage, in books, in films, in art even, where the forces of the Tokugawa and their allies gather around Osaka Castle, trying to do some kind of deal, trying to force Hideyori and those around him to give up. But in the end, the siege turns bloody, the castle is on fire, and we have these famous scenes of Hideyori and his mother huddled together as everyone around them is burning up and dying. So the siege of Osaka, I think, is a really big event because that is probably the last moment at which you've got a really credible figurehead for opposing the Tokugawa. So once that's done, 1615, and then Tokugawa Ieyasu passes away the next year, a lot of people would probably see that as being more or less the end of things. But I think there's probably one final chapter that's worth thinking about, even just quite briefly, because we mentioned earlier on that Hideyoshi particularly disliked foreign Christian power in Kyushu. So he had a powerful dislike for them, but after the takeover of Tokugawa Ieyasu, he early on at least thought more in terms of using these people as allies. So you can have dealings with the Portuguese and the Spanish in particular, if you want to understand more about New Mexico or the Philippines, if you want to develop Japan's own mines, the Spanish have great expertise in mining, that's quite useful. The English and the Dutch start to turn up in the early years of the 1600s. There again, there's a sense of Japan early on under the Tokugawa wanting to reach out with these friendships and alliances across the world, be a kind of global power. If they could be, it would be the first truly global power, I think, in East Asia. But what seems to happen across these early decades is that there's a sense that Japanese Christians, most of them living on Kyushu, as we've said, aren't entirely to be relied upon. There's always been the sense in Japan, as they put it in the modern era, that you can't simultaneously be loyal to two J's, Jesus and Japan. And although they wouldn't quite have put it like that in this era, there's still that sense that these people aren't fully loyal to legitimate authorities in Japan. And this really comes home, I think, to the Tokugawa shogunate in the 1630s in Kyushu, where you have what's called the Shimabara Rebellion, 1637 to 1638, where basically a ragtag bunch of peasants with a little bit of samurai leadership managed to hole themselves up in a castle and fight off wave after wave of samurai who come in to try and pacify them and take the castle. And it's extraordinarily embarrassing. You know, these samurai try everything. They send ninjas into the castle, they send spies in who get caught, they try and dig tunnels under the castle, but the people inside the castle fill the tunnels with feces and urine. They try all sorts of things, and it takes months and months and months and reinforcements to finally get this rebellion under control. And the story that the Tokugawa tell after the Shimabara Rebellion is that this was a case of foreign interference. You know, these people, these peasants, couldn't possibly hold off samurai unless they were somehow being supported and orchestrated by these nefarious foreign Christian powers. And so probably the last development in this long process of unification is the shutting down almost completely of Japan's borders. They'll still deal with China and Korea at particular points within Japan. They'll have that trade with Southeast Asia. They'll have a limited trade as well. But the Portuguese are thrown out. The Spanish are thrown out. The English aren't terribly interested in the end anyway. The Japanese will only deal, when we're thinking about European powers, with the Dutch, and only at this little artificial island called Dejima, just a few feet worth of wooden bridge off the coast of Nagasaki. So this process of warring states, then these long years of unification, ends up with a sense that Japan's security going into the future relies to some degree on preventing foreign interference. And those edicts, effectively creating a country that's at least partially closed, are issued across the 1630s. And I think it's probably at that point that the new Tokugawa dynasty is relatively secure.
It's an interesting example of one of those periods in history that's really hard to nail down an end date to, isn't it? It's easy to say it's 1590, let's move on, but it sounds like you could stretch that for almost half a century further if you really want to.
I think that's true. Yes, in retrospect, it's easy to say 1590. If you were an advisor to Tokugawa Ieyasu or one of his sons, and if you were of a slightly nervous temperament, you probably wouldn't date it until maybe 1615, the end of the siege of Osaka, or potentially once you've secured those borders and these foreigners who are rumored to want to colonize Japan, certainly where the Portuguese and the Spanish are concerned, once they are under control, once they've fully got the message, then perhaps you might start to relax.
And once unification is complete, whenever we decide that that might actually have been, does that represent a change for Japan? I guess what I'm getting at is, do they view this as going back to the way things should have always been done? Or is this seen as a new start for a new country?
I'm going to give you the boring historian's answer and probably say that it's a bit of both. In terms of it being new, certainly new in the context of the past century or so, if you were, your average cultivator out in the fields, you no longer had that same risk of being called up as a foot soldier, having your fields trampled over, having your money, your crops taken to feed an army. I think there's an enormous degree of stability that Japan begins to enjoy from the early 1600s. And you see the economy start to boom as a result. A couple of other things that I think are probably quite important to this period. One, we mentioned that hostage system earlier on, where the daimyo, either the daimyo or a member of his family, key members of his family, have to be in Edo at any particular time under the watchful eye of the Tokugawa. That involves an enormous amount of travel, obviously, across Japan to and from Edo. So you get these roadside developments opening up. You have shops, restaurants, inns, people selling all sorts of things. Now, because you can travel across Japan, goods from different parts of Japan are being traded in much greater numbers than they were before. So there's the creation of a really strong economy in Japan. And probably the last big part of it here, maybe two last big parts of it here. One is the creation of a social hierarchy, which in some ways grows out of the past, but it's enforced down to the letter, even in terms of what grade of cotton or silk you might be able to wear, depending on where you fall in the hierarchy. At the top, of course, you've got the samurai. Then you've got farmers, because they're considered to be producers. And below them, you have the merchants, who aren't really thought to be they're certainly interesting for the things they offer in their shops, but because they don't produce anything, they trade in the work of others. They are below farmers and craftspeople. And this is quite rigidly enforced. As I say, these various edicts, also in terms of who can and can't travel across Japan. Pilgrimage becomes quite popular because that's considered a legitimate excuse for doing a little bit of travel and sightseeing. But there's a sense that just as you secure your borders, so you also secure yourself socially from the inside by having a relatively stratified society and really trying to keep to that. I suppose a very last thought about what this means for Japan in the early decades of 1600s and onwards is that in cities like Edo, Osaka, and Kyoto, you start to have the flourishing of a beautiful urban culture. It becomes called the culture of the floating world eventually. Originally a Buddhist term to mean, that nothing stays the same, everything is passing away. But it loses that sense and takes on a sense of enjoying the moment, having fun. So you have tea houses, you have geisha, you have kabuki plays, you have puppet theatre, you have the production of these beautiful pieces of woodblock art, you have books, you have medicine, you have people interested in science and in philosophy. So a real flourishing of intellectual and artistic culture, which had been there before. But once you've got peace and you've got the chance to reflect and take a little bit of a rest, you really see a boom for this. So Japan has, I think, real golden years, the second half of the 1600s in particular, which if you compare, I suppose, to what's going on in Europe at the time, it's quite an enviable level of peace that Japan enjoys.
I was going to say this moment of unification, but let's maybe call it this process and period of unification. How significant is that to Japan today? Is that something that they reflect on today, that they think about a lot today?
I think it is, partly because of what came next. And without going into, enormous amounts of detail, I suppose the next major point in this history came in 1853, 1854, with the arrival of the Americans. Soon after, you got the arrival of the British, the French, and the Russians, really trying to persuade Japan, or to be a little bit more honest about it, I suppose, force Japan into a global system of diplomacy and trade, which for some people in Japan, I think especially after close of the Second World War, was seen in the long view to have been a mixed blessing for Japan. This opening up to the West, all the political, economic, cultural, military problems that Japan had to go through as a result of that process, incredibly difficult for them. And so for a lot of people, there's a certain amount of nostalgia, I think, for the period before that, which is the 1600s, 1700s, early 1800s, the sense of Japan as peaceful, settled, cultivated, a high literacy rate. Of course, for some people, life was drudge, out in the fields. You can't go anywhere. You have a certain limited diet, not just your clothes, but even your diet was limited, at least officially, by some of the Tokugawa edicts. So maybe not tremendously entertaining unless you had a certain amount of money to spend, but nevertheless, it was peaceful, settled, and identifiably Japanese. For people who worry, and many in Japan do, about whether Japanese culture, certainly in the modern era, is really Japanese anymore, given all the other influences that have come in, the Tokugawa era stands as a time. You only have to look at a 20-minute drama, look at their clothes, look at the architecture, look at how they do their hair, speak to each other, the food, none of these foreign loan words in there anymore. It seems thoroughly and straightforwardly Japanese. I think there are a lot of people who appreciate that period for those sorts of reasons.
So is the Tokugawa period then something like Japan's rose-tinted spectacles that they will measure everything else against, that period where they forget all of the drudge of everyday life, but that's when Japan was at its pinnacle, at its most Japanese?
Yeah, I think it's probably one of two. And I think certainly in particular, the early part of the Tokugawa era. So from later on, from I think certainly mid 1700s onwards, when Tokugawa Japan faces various problems, you can see lots of people wanting to ask, how do we go back to a time when Tokugawa Ieyasu, in his great wisdom, was organizing this place, was setting an example, was effectively writing our laws, even, offering us our morality, our standards of behavior. So really from the middle 1700s, certainly after that, people are already looking back to the early Tokugawa era as a kind of golden age. I suppose the other golden age, just briefly, would be around the time of the year 1000, when you have the Tale of Genji being written by Murasaki. You have a sense of classical Japan in that period, where everything is about court life, aristocrats, poetry, romance, people with such a high degree of sophistication to them. Yes, it's partly based on Chinese culture that's come in. Lots of people will be reading their books and poetry in Chinese alongside Japanese. But nevertheless, there's a sense of that period being quintessentially Japanese. I think that would probably be the other great period, unless you're a particular fan of samurai films, in which case the Sengoku era and the unification era would be very much up your street.
And I would question who isn't a fan of samurai films.
Well, exactly. It's nice because whenever I think, oh dear, we're always going on about the samurai, can't we think about something else when we think about Japan? But then you go to Japan and you see all this fantastic interest in the samurai. There was a little drama I was watching a while back where the premise was that a rather spoiled teenage boy from our own times in Japan gets sent back. And I think he did a body swap or in some other way came to be confused with the young Oda Nobunaga. And suddenly he has to face all the challenges that Oda Nobunaga did, effectively living in an age which makes greater demands, especially on young men. So just a little illustration that it's not just Westerners who really think about these periods and the excitement and the drama and the values that go alongside them.
Well, it's been absolutely wonderful to think about the long end of unification. What I've learned, I guess, is that we can't pin unification down to a single date when something was done and that's it, it's over. It was a long period, which I guess helps to forge this idea of Japan and being Japanese that is still in Japan and with the world today. I guess for a lot of people, that's what we think of as Japanese as well.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's a really formative period for Japan and its reputation abroad. I'd certainly agree.
Well, thank you so much for joining us again, Chris. It's been great to talk to you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Echoes of History, a Ubisoft podcast brought to you by History Hit. Next time, we'll be discovering more about the first contact between Japan and Europeans in the form of Jesuit missionaries from Portugal. So join us for the next episode to find out more about the history behind the world of Assassin's Creed.